When a generational athlete stops relying on words and starts communicating through smaller, more deliberate choices, it is worth paying attention.
Caitlin Clark could be sending a message to the Indiana Fever. Hey, I might not sign that epic. Y'all pushing everybody else for MVP. Stephanie White is having tantrums every time I shoot the ball. She's falling over herself on the sidelines. I don't have to deal with this. I can go elsewhere.
A press conference or a public trade request is not required for a message to land inside a front office. Sometimes a single pre-game entrance is enough to get people talking. Before Indiana's matchup against the New York Liberty, Caitlin Clark stepped onto the court in a new purple colorway of her signature Nike Caitlin 1, and it did not take long for fans and analysts to start reading into it to be clear about what is fact and what is interpretation.
Uh-oh, SpaghettiOs. Caitlin Clark introducing the Statue of Liberty edition, the New York Liberty edition. I already know you damn near besties with Sabrina. We think you cool with Lexi. No, you go way back with Sabrina.
The purple pair was the fourth colorway Clark had unveiled publicly, following earlier releases in blue, yellow, and white. There was no confirmed statement from Clark, Nike, or the Fever organization tying the design to any message about her future with the team. What followed was speculation, not confirmation, and it deserves to be treated that way. Still, the timing was enough to get people talking, and it is worth walking through why that reaction happened at all, and what it reveals about the broader tension surrounding this Indiana team. Clark's signature line has become one of the more closely tracked stories in the sport this year on its own merits. Since Nike first confirmed the shoe, she has rolled out a steady sequence of colorways tied to milestone performances, franchise records, and marquee matchups, each one generating its own wave of coverage independent of anything happening in the standings. Against that backdrop, a new pair debuting ahead of a nationally watched game against New York was, on its face, simply the next entry in a pattern the shoe had already established. That context matters, because it means the release did not need to carry any hidden meaning to justify its timing. It fit the release schedule Clark and Nike had already been running all season. The speculation that followed came not from anything unusual about the shoe itself, but from the emotional state of a fan base already primed to look for signs of discontent. That is worth sitting with for a moment because it reframes the story. The interesting piece here is not really about footwear at all. It is about what it means when a fan base is ready to interpret a routine product release as a coded signal of dissatisfaction. That kind of reading does not happen in a vacuum. It happens when trust between supporters and the organization they follow has already been strained by a string of separate, unrelated issues that had nothing to do with sneakers. Fans who connected the dots pointed to the moment in a wider context. New York is a city with a track record of luring top talent and assembling rosters built to win immediately. When a star player based somewhere else shows up in a rival market wearing new gear, in a color that some viewers associated with the opposing franchise, it is not surprising that speculation followed. Whether that reading holds any weight is a separate question, and nothing in the public record confirms it was intentional messaging. What can be said with more confidence is that the reaction itself says something about how fans are currently feeling about the direction of the Indiana organization, and that sentiment did not appear out of nowhere. It is also worth noting how quickly the theory spread once it appeared. Within hours of the game, clips and screenshots of the shoe were circulating across social platforms, often paired with commentary about roster construction, coaching decisions, or the physical toll of the season. The speed of that spread says less about the shoe and more about how much pent-up commentary was already looking for an outlet. A fan base that felt its concerns were being addressed would likely have shrugged off a new colorway as exactly what it was. A fan base already frustrated found in it a convenient symbol for everything else it wanted to say. To understand why a routine shoe reveal became the subject of debate, it helps to look at the decisions being made by the people managing the roster. The construction of this team has drawn consistent criticism throughout the season. Critics argue that draft assets and free agency decisions have not been used efficiently, and that the roster around Clark has not been built to complement her particular strengths. Rather than surrounding her with shooters and playmakers suited to a fast read-and-react style, the lineup has at times slipped into slower, more isolated possessions that make life easier for opposing defenses. That is not a universally held opinion, but it is a common one among fans and analysts who follow the team closely, and it forms the backdrop against which every off-court story, including a sneaker release, gets interpreted. Supporters of the front office's approach would counter that roster building around a young core takes time, and that expecting a finished product this early in Clark's career overlooks the normal development curve most contending teams go through. They point to the difficulty of adding proven veterans through free agency when the WNBA's salary structure limits what any single team can offer, and to the reality that other contenders have spent multiple seasons assembling the rosters currently competing for championships. That argument carries weight, and it is part of why this remains a genuinely contested debate among people who follow the league closely, rather than a settled verdict against management. Still, the counter-argument does not erase the frustration. It simply explains where some of it may be misplaced, even as fans continue to voice it. The frustration extends beyond roster construction and into what happens during games themselves. When Clark is defended physically at half-court, grabbed by the jersey, or knocked off balance without a whistle, many fans expect the head coach to respond forcefully. Stephanie White's demeanor on the sideline in these moments has drawn criticism from a section of the fan base, who have described her reactions as too measured given the physicality directed at her star player. Others push back on that read, arguing that a head coach picking fights with officials rarely changes outcomes and can backfire through additional technical fouls. Both views exist among people who watch the team regularly, and it is worth acknowledging that coaching temperament is one of the more subjective threads in this conversation. What is not in dispute is that the perception of a passive bench has become part of the broader narrative fans have built around this season. There is a version of this argument that gives White more credit than her critics do. Coaches who spend timeouts and sideline energy arguing every missed call risk losing focus on the actual game plan, and officiating crews are not known for reversing course because a coach raised his or her voice. Some fans who defend White's approach point to her in-game adjustments and rotation management as evidence that her attention is where it needs to be, even if her public reactions to physical play read as understated on camera. That defense does not fully satisfy fans who want to see a coach visibly fight for a franchise player. But it does complicate the idea that passivity on the sideline reflects indifference rather than a deliberate, if debatable, coaching philosophy. That same tension shows up in complaints about on-court chemistry. Some fans and commentators have pointed to a pattern of missed assignments, inconsistent screening and spacing that does not always support a fast-paced offense. Aaliyah Boston, in particular, has been the subject of criticism from portions of the fan base who feel her chemistry with Clark has been inconsistent, whether through screens that do not fully seal off defenders or through possessions that stall in isolation rather than flowing through ball movement. Again, this is a matter of interpretation and fan sentiment rather than settled analysis, and reasonable observers disagree on how much of this is coaching, personnel fit, or simply the natural growing pains of a young roster still figuring out its identity. Layer an ongoing frustration about the transparency of injury reporting, and it becomes easier to understand why fans are primed to read meaning into something as small as a shoe colorway. It is worth adding some balance here as well. Boston has drawn praise in stretches of the season for her rebounding and post-scoring, and some analysts argue that the chemistry issues fans point to have more to do with spacing philosophy at the coaching level than with any shortfall on her part individually. Two players learning to play off each other at a high level, particularly a ball-dominant guard and an interior scorer who also wants touches, is a common source of early career friction on plenty of teams that go on to figure it out. Whether Indiana's version of that friction resolves itself with time or requires a more significant change is exactly the kind of question that will not be settled by a single game or a single season, and fans on both sides of that debate can point to real evidence for their position. The physicality directed at Clark specifically has become one of the most consistently discussed storylines of the season. Fans and some media members have pointed to a pattern in which defenders make extended contact with her away from the ball, using positioning that borders on holding without officials calling it. Clips have circulated showing defenders wrapping an arm around her at the perimeter, or making contact that looks more like football blocking than basketball defense, with no whistle. Whether this reflects a genuine officiating gap specific to Clark, a broader league-wide inconsistency in how physical play is called, or simply the normal variance of missed calls that happens to every player at some point, remains a matter of ongoing debate rather than settled fact. What is measurable is that Clark's free throw rate has been a recurring talking point among analysts trying to reconcile the physicality shown in game film with the calls actually being made. The league office has faced its own share of scrutiny over officiating consistency this season, not exclusively tied to any one player, which complicates the narrative that Clark alone is being singled out. Referees across the league have been the subject of criticism from multiple fan bases, coaches, and players over inconsistent whistle standards from game to game. That broader context does not erase the specific complaints raised about the calls Clark does or does not receive, but it does suggest the issue may be less about any individual player and more about a systemic challenge the league has not yet solved. Viewers drawing conclusions about intent, whether from officials or from the league, should weigh that broader pattern before assuming any single explanation accounts for what shows up in the box score. Set against that backdrop, New York represents something close to the opposite experience for a modern star. The Liberty have built a roster around proven, complementary talent, with players like Breanna Stewart, Jonquel Jones, and Sabrina Ionescu occupying clearly defined roles within a system built to win now. Fans who follow both teams have noted the visible camaraderie among Liberty players, and some have pointed to public comments of mutual respect between Ionescu and Clark as evidence of a friendly relationship between two of the league's most prominent guards. None of that amounts to evidence of anything beyond what it appears to be on its surface: two competitors who respect each other. Reading a larger message into it, as some fans did following the sneaker release, moves from observation into speculation, and that distinction matters. It is also worth remembering that New York's current roster did not arrive fully formed. The Liberty spent several off-seasons making deliberate additions and absorbing their own share of criticism along the way before the current group came together into a championship contender. Comparing a still-developing Indiana roster to an established New York team, without accounting for the years of roster building that separate the two situations, risks flattening a more complicated story into a simpler one. That does not mean the comparison is meaningless. It means the gap between the two organizations may say as much about timeline as it does about competence, and fans weighing the two should hold both possibilities at once rather than settling on whichever one fits their existing frustration. Still, speculation is not baseless when it grows out of a real pattern of frustration. If the criticisms about roster construction, coaching decisions, and inconsistent officiating continue to accumulate without visible change, it becomes easier to understand why fans are quick to interpret ordinary events, like a shoe launch, through the lens of discontent. Loyalty in professional sports runs in both directions. Front offices are expected to build competitive rosters and protect their most valuable assets, both from poor roster fit and from unchecked physical play on the court. When a fan base feels that obligation is not being met, speculation tends to fill the space left by unanswered questions. History offers some perspective here as well. Stars in other sports have used far more direct methods than a shoe colorway to signal displeasure with their organizations, from trade requests filed through agents to pointed comments in post-game interviews. Clark has done none of that. She has continued to speak publicly about her commitment to the Fever and to Indiana, and nothing in her public statements this season has echoed the kind of frustration fans have projected onto her footwear. That gap between what fans want to believe and what the player has actually said is worth acknowledging directly, because it is easy for a compelling theory to outrun the evidence supporting it, especially when that theory lines up neatly with feelings fans already had. None of this means Clark's purple Caitlin 1s were a coded message aimed at Indiana's front office. There is no statement, interview, or confirmed reporting that supports that interpretation, and it should be treated as fan speculation rather than fact. What the moment does capture is the current mood surrounding the Fever, a fan base watching roster decisions closely, questioning coaching choices under pressure, and increasingly vocal about a perceived gap in how physical play against their star is officiated. Whether that mood translates into anything beyond frustrated commentary is not something anyone can predict with confidence. What can be said is that the organization has a season's worth of accumulated questions still waiting on answers, and every small, unrelated event, including a new pair of shoes, is now being read against that backdrop. For an organization built around one of the most marketable athletes in the sport, that dynamic carries real weight. Public perception shapes sponsorship conversations, media coverage, and eventually the kind of free agents willing to sign on to play alongside a star. A front office does not need to solve every criticism raised by fans this season, but ignoring a pattern of recurring complaints about roster fit, about coaching response to physical play, about transparency around injuries carries its own cost over time. Whether or not a shoe colorway was ever meant to say anything at all, the fact that so many people were ready to read a message into it says something on its own about where trust between this fan base and this front office currently stands.